The veteran thought he'd seen the worst of humanity on the battlefield. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found hanging from that tree in the mountains. A massive black military dog bleeding, shaking seconds from death, suspended by a rope with a handwritten sign hanging from its neck. Too dangerous. The veteran froze. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to execute a trained military canine and left him to die, but when the veteran cut the rope and the dog collapsed into his arms, something shocking happened, something that revealed this dog wasn't dangerous at all. He was terrified, and he was trying to warn the veteran about something much, much worse hiding in those mountains. Stay until the end, because what happened next changed everything. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The mountains had become the only place where Daniel Hayes could breathe. After 12 years of military service, 3 combat tours, and more scars than he cared to count, the world felt too loud, too chaotic, too unpredictable. But out here, far from the buzzing cities and the constant hum of people, there was silence. A silence that didn't demand anything from him. A silence that didn't judge him for the nights he still woke up drenched in sweat. Convinced explosions were ripping through the sky again. Every weekend. Without fail, he strapped on his worn hiking boots and disappeared into the wilderness. The pine-scented air, the crunch of gravel under his feet, the distant rush of river water, all of it helped him forget the memories he carried like invisible weights. But today felt different. Daniel couldn't explain why, but there was a heaviness in the wind, something unsettled. As if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, he paused beside a fallen log, letting the cool breeze brush against his face. These hikes were his therapy, his escape from a world that didn't understand what happened to soldiers once the war ended. People thanked him for his service, but no one saw the restless nights, the sudden jolts awake, the ghosts of friends he couldn't save. Out here, those ghosts felt quieter. The sky was overcast, though the forecast hadn't mentioned rain. Thick clouds rolled across the peaks, casting shifting shadows over the valley below. Daniel adjusted the straps of his backpack and continued along the narrow trail, his senses sharp out of habit. Every rustle, every distant snap of a branch made him turn slightly, scanning his surroundings. Years of survival training didn't just fade. He inhaled deeply, but something in the air made him stop. A faint echo. Not a bird. Not wind. Something else. Something wrong. Daniel frowned, listening harder. The mountains were silent again, too silent. And for the first time on his hike, a sliver of unease slid down his spine. Something was out there, something waiting, and soon he would find it. Daniel stood completely still, his breath suspended in the chilled mountain air. For a moment, the world around him felt frozen. No wind, no birds, no rustling branches. Just a strange, lingering quiet that pressed against his ears like a warning. He had learned long ago that silence in the wild was never innocent. It meant something had disturbed the natural rhythm. Something that didn't belong. Then it came again. A sound, soft, fractured, carried through the trees, not loud enough to be a roar. Not sharp enough to be a gunshot. Not rhythmic like footsteps. It was a cry that didn't fit anywhere in this peaceful mountain landscape. Daniel's heart tightened. It wasn't human, he could tell that much. But it wasn't the cry of a deer or elk either. This sound was deeper, rougher, edged with pain. It echoed faintly off the rocks, bouncing through the valley before dissolving into silence once more. He lifted his head, scanning the distant tree line. What was that? He muttered under his breath. His instincts, honed by years of war, pricked at him, alert, focused. Something was hurt. Something was suffering. He took a slow step forward, boots sinking into the damp soil. The echo came again, this time shorter, weaker. Daniel felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Whatever was out there was fading fast. Another sound followed, a sudden splash, faint but distinct, as if something heavy had disturbed the river. Downstream. Daniel tightened the grip on his hiking pole and began moving toward the noise. weaving between pine trunks and uneven rocks. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a familiar sense of urgency he hadn't felt since the battlefield. Something needed help, and Daniel Hayes wasn't the kind of man to walk away. Daniel pushed through the thick brush, following the river's echo as it grew louder with every step. The forest floor sloped downward until he reached a rocky bank where icy water rushed over jagged stones. Mist hovered above the river like a ghostly veil, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something metallic. Blood. Daniel, single quotes, S pulse kicked up. He scanned the shoreline and froze. First, he thought it was a shadow dangling from a tree branch. But as he stepped closer, the shape sharpened into something unmistakably alive. A massive black dog, easily over 100 pounds, hung from a rope tied high on a gnarled branch. Its body swung slightly with the current splashing at its hind legs, the fur around its chest soaked with dark, drying blood. The dog's paws twitched weakly, claws scraping the air. Its muzzle was twisted in agony, teeth bared not in threat but in unbearable pain. Daniel felt his stomach drop. "Who would do this?" he whispered. The dog's eyes flicked open, revealing a dull, terrified amber. It wasn't snarling. It wasn't aggressive. It was pleading, desperate for someone to help. Then Daniel saw the sign. A rough square of cardboard hung around the dog's neck. The letters scrawled in harsh, angry strokes. "Too dangerous." The words hit him like a punch. Dangerous? This wasn't danger, this was cruelty. Daniel stepped forward carefully, assessing the situation like he had countless times in combat. The rope was tight, cutting into the dog's neck. If he didn't act fast... Another weak whimper rose from the animal, a sound so broken Daniel felt it in his chest. "Hang on, buddy," he murmured, voice low and steady. "I've got you." He circled the tree, boots slipping on wet stones. The knot was pulled tight, expertly tied, too clean, too deliberate. This wasn't an accident or a hunter's trap. Someone wanted this dog dead, and they wanted it to suffer. Daniel's jaw clenched. He grabbed his pocket knife, its blade flashing in the cold light, and reached upward. The dog's trembling intensified as he got closer. But there was no aggression, only fear. Daniel steadied the rope with one hand, knife poised with the other. "Easy. I'm getting you out of here." One clean slice. The rope snapped. The dog fell, and everything changed. The moment the rope severed, the dog's body dropped heavily into Daniel's arms, knocking him backward onto the cold riverbank. Water splashed over them both, but Daniel barely felt it. The dog lay limp across his lap, massive, trembling, struggling for breath. Up close, the extent of the injuries became painfully clear. Deep gashes along the shoulders, matted fur soaked with blood. Rope burns etched harshly into the neck. "Easy, easy," Daniel whispered, lowering the dog gently onto a patch of dry grass. "You're all right now. You're safe." The animal flinched at the sound of his voice, muscles contracting in pure reflex. But even then, no growl, no snap, no fight. Only fear, only exhaustion. Daniel had seen that look before. In injured soldiers who had been pushed past their breaking point, the dog tried to stand, but its legs buckled instantly, collapsing under its own weight. Daniel pressed a steadying hand to its side. "Don't move. You'll hurt yourself more." Its breathing was ragged, chest rising in uneven, painful jolts. The rope had cut deep, leaving a swollen, bruised ring where it had been tied far too tight. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted to restrain the dog. They had intended it to die slowly. A surge of anger flared in Daniel's chest, hot and sharp. But he forced himself to stay focused. Emotions wouldn't save the animal, action would. He tore open his backpack, ripping out a first aid kit he always carried out of habit. Gauze, antiseptic, anything that could stabilize the dog, long enough to move it someplace safe. The dog watched him with glassy, half-closed eyes, uncertain, trembling, yet trying to trust him. Daniel worked quickly but gently, wrapping the worst wounds, cleaning the blood where he could. "You're gonna make it," he said firmly, as if sheer conviction could keep the dog alive. "I'm not leaving you out here." The dog's paw shifted toward him, barely a touch. Just enough for Daniel to feel it, a silent plea, a fragile moment of trust, and Daniel knew he wasn't walking out of these mountains alone anymore. Daniel gently slid his arms under the dog again, lifting the heavy, trembling body just enough to ease it onto a dry patch of moss. The dog let out a faint grunt of pain, but even wounded, it made no attempt to bite or resist. That alone told Daniel something important. This wasn't a wild animal. This dog had discipline, training, purpose. As Daniel secured another bandage, his fingers brushed against a cold piece of metal buried beneath the thick fur. He paused. Slowly, he pushed the fur aside and found a small, weathered identification tag clipped to the dog's collar. The edges were scratched, smeared with dirt and dried blood, but the engraving was still visible. Min 9 Unit Active Service Name, Shadow. Daniel stared at the tag, his heartbeat thudding. A military dog, Shadow twitched at the sound of his own name, his ears lifting weakly before drooping again. Instinctive response. Conditioned behavior. Daniel recognized it immediately. He had served with K9 units before. These dogs were more than animals. They were soldiers. Loyal, precise, brave. And someone had hung this one from a tree like discarded trash. What happened to you, buddy? Daniel murmured. Shadow's gaze flickered upward, meeting his eyes for the first time with something other than fear. Not comfort awareness, recognition, as if he understood the tone of Daniel's voice, the steady calm of someone who'd spent years in combat just like he had. Daniel checked the rest of the collar. Embedded along the inner lining were tiny metal ridges shaped in a coded sequence. Military encryption. Coordinates, ID numbers, information far beyond standard identification. This dog wasn't just trained. He was important. A faint whine escaped Shadow's throat as Daniel examined a series of older scars tracing down his flank long, thin marks from shrapnel, close combat, and grueling missions. Shadow wasn't new to pain. He had survived battles most soldiers never talked about, but the wounds from today weren't from war. They were deliberate, personal. Daniel's jaw tightened. Someone had tried to erase a soldier. And Daniel Hayes wasn't going to let that happen. Shadow shifted slightly, as if trying to rise again, but his legs trembled violently beneath him. Daniel placed a steady hand on the dog's side. Easy. Don't push it. But Shadow tried anyway, an instinct driven not by stubbornness but urgency. Something deep inside him was insisting he stand, insisting he move, insisting he get somewhere. Then, without warning, his body gave out. Shadow collapsed fully onto the ground, his head dropping hard against Daniel's knee. His breathing hitched, a sharp, desperate gasp that made Daniel's chest tighten. The dog's muscles spasmed briefly before going slack, his entire frame sinking under its own weight. No, stay with me, Daniel whispered, lifting Shadow's head gently. The dog's eyelids fluttered, half open, unfocused. He wasn't fainting from the rope or blood loss alone. There was something heavier behind his collapse and exhaustion, rooted in fear and urgency. Shadow lifted one weak paw and pressed it into Daniel's wrist, not randomly, not searching for balance, pointing directly toward the thick stretch of forest. Behind them. Daniel froze. Something's out there. Isn't it? He murmured. Shadow's breathing quickened at the sound, his ears twitching despite the pain. He pushed again, this time scraping his claws weakly against the ground in the same direction. Not running away, not reacting to noise. Guiding him, sending a message the only way he could. Daniel swallowed hard, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No sounds. But he trusted instincts, his own and the dog's. Shadow wasn't pointing toward danger by accident. He was pointing toward cause, toward the reason someone had tried to kill him. Daniel felt a chill rip through him. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much larger. Daniel's eyes swept across the tree line, searching for movement, but the forest stood unnervingly still. No birds fluttered through the branches. No insects buzzed. Even the river behind him seemed to quiet, as if nature itself was afraid to make a sound. Shadow's weak paw remained pressed against Daniel's wrist, trembling but insistent, pointing deeper into the woods. All right, buddy. Daniel whispered, lowering Shadow gently onto the moss. I hear you. He stood slowly, every sense sharpening like steel. Years of combat had trained him to recognize when he wasn't alone, when eyes watched from a distance, when danger sat just outside of sight. And right now, that instinct screamed through him. A breeze drifted through the pines and carried with it a faint, unmistakable smell. Gunpowder. Fresh. Daniel single quotes S heartbeat thudded once, heavy and cold. He moved toward the scent, crouching slightly as he approached the edge of the brush. Then he saw them. Tracks. Not animal tracks boots? Several pairs? Deep impressions, spaced in long strides as if whoever made them had been running. And not just running past? Running from something or toward something. Daniel traced one of the tracks with his fingers. The edges were still crisp. Whoever had been here was not far ahead. Shadow let out a faint, broken whine behind him. Daniel turned back to the dog, noticing now a fresh scrape along the hind leg, long and shallow, like Shadow had been dragged before being hoisted into the tree. A metallic glint caught Daniel's attention near the base of the trunk. He knelt and picked up a spent bullet casing, standard military issue. A chill worked down his spine. Shadow wasn't attacked by hunters. He wasn't abandoned by civilians. He was targeted by trained professionals, and they were close. Daniel slipped the casing into his pocket, rising slowly as his eyes hardened with resolve. Someone had tried to silence this dog. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And if Shadow had survived long enough to point him in this direction, it meant the threat wasn't over. Daniel stepped back toward Shadow, knees bending as he touched the dog's head gently. Don't worry, he murmured. I'm not letting them finish what they started. The forest remained silent, *2 silent, and somewhere in that silence, Daniel felt the enemy watching. Daniel knew Shadow wouldn't survive much longer out in the open. Whatever those men wanted, whatever they were hiding, the dog had already endured more than enough. He slipped his arms beneath Shadow's massive frame, braced himself, and lifted. The dog was heavy, far heavier than he looked, but Daniel gritted his teeth and pushed forward. He had carried wounded soldiers before. He could carry one more. The forest trail leading to his remote cabin twisted between towering pines and narrow rock passages. Each step felt urgent, but Daniel forced himself to move steadily to avoid jostling Shadow's wounds. The dog whimpered softly against his chest. But even through the pain, he kept glancing toward the deeper woods, as if still trying to warn Daniel of something he couldn't see. After nearly 20 minutes of trudging uphill, Daniel finally spotted the outline of the cabin, a small wooden structure he had built himself. Hidden from most maps and unreachable by road, it had always been a place of retreat, not a battlefield. But today, it felt like both. He pushed open the door with his shoulder and laid Shadow gently onto an old wool blanket beside the stone fireplace. The cabin smelled of cedar and ash, familiar and comforting, but Shadow remained tense, his breaths shallow. Daniel quickly closed the curtains, then lit a lantern to examine the dog more thoroughly. As he adjusted the collar to clean around the wounds, his fingers brushed something rigid along the inside band. He pulled the collar toward the light. There, etched into the inner lining, were tiny engraved numbers arranged in a sequence only. Someone with military intelligence experience would recognize coordinates, operation codes, encrypted data. Daniel's chest tightened. Shadow, what were you carrying? The dog blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the question, then rested his head on the blanket with a weak sigh. Daniel grabbed his notebook and began copying the codes, his mind racing. This wasn't random abuse. This was an execution attempt, one meant to bury whatever information Shadow carried. Outside, a branch snapped. Daniel froze. They had found him. Shadow's eyes flickered as Daniel finished copying the codes. For a moment, the dog's gaze drifted not to the door or the forest outside, but somewhere far away. Somewhere only he could see. Daniel had witnessed that look before in wounded soldiers, the haunted stare of someone reliving a battle they never truly left, and suddenly, the pieces began to knit themselves together. Shadow wasn't just a military dog. He was a combat tracker, trained for high-risk reconnaissance missions. Dogs like him weren't assigned to ordinary patrols. They were used for the missions commanders didn't talk about. Missions that went wrong long before anyone admitted it. Daniel placed a steady hand on Shadow's head. "Show me," he whispered, as if the dog could somehow hear the request inside his voice, and Shadow did. His breathing deepened. Trembling as memories surged through him like a storm breaking free, he saw the desert, the orange sky burning. The rumble of armored trucks. Shadow had been deployed with an elite unit, men he knew by scent, by voice, by the rhythm of their footsteps. He trusted them the way soldiers trusted each other with their lives. The mission had been simple: infiltrate an abandoned compound suspected of hiding stolen military weapons. But the moment they breached the perimeter, everything changed. Shadow had smelled it first: explosives buried beneath the sand, masked by chemicals. He barked the alert, pulling hard against his handler's grip. But one of the officers, the same scent Shadow later recognized near the tree, dismissed the warning. "False alarm," he had laughed. It wasn't. The explosion tore through the compound, sending men sprawling, ripping shrapnel through Shadow's flank. In the chaos, as dust blinded the unit and flames surged, Shadow saw something the others didn't. The officer who dismissed his warning was not thrown back by the blast. He walked away from it, unaffected, unafraid. Shadow, bleeding and disoriented, followed him only to witness him planting additional charges inside a storage room filled not with weapons, but military evidence. Evidence meant to expose corruption within the unit. Shadow barked, growled, tried to stop him. But the officer struck him down, clipped his tracking collar, and radioed a lie. K9 compromised. Too dangerous, eliminating. Shadow had survived the blast. So the officer tried again, this time by hanging him from a tree. Shadow whimpered as the memory ended, his body twitching with phantom pain. Daniel's jaw tightened. Shadow hadn't been betrayed by the enemy. He had been betrayed by his own. The snap of that branch outside wasn't the wind. Daniel knew the difference. In the military, he had learned to recognize the subtle language of danger, the uneven weight shift of boots on dry bark, the faint crunch that came from a human step, not an animal's. And right now, that sound carried the quiet precision of men who didn't want to be found. Shadow lifted his head weakly, ears twitching despite the pain. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, thin, shaky, but unmistakably alert. Even half-conscious, his instinct to protect remained razor-sharp. Daniel moved silently to the window, lifting the curtain just an inch. At first, he saw nothing but trees swaying under the cold mountain wind. But then movement. A figure slipping between the pines, dressed in muted tactical colors. Another appeared seconds later, crouched low, scanning the terrain like a hunter closing in on prey. His blood ran cold. They weren't hikers. They weren't locals. These were trained operatives, and they were looking for Shadow. Daniel stepped back from the window, fist tightening. He had been hoping for time to treat Shadow, time to decode the coordinates, time to understand the nightmare this dog had survived. But time had run out. The enemy had followed the trail, and now they were closing in with ruthless precision. Shadow tried to push himself up, legs shaking beneath him. "No," Daniel whispered, kneeling beside him. "You've done enough. Let me handle this." Shadow let out a soft huff as though arguing, but he sank back onto the blanket, his gaze fixed on the door. A sudden knock shattered the silence, not loud, not panicked. A deliberate, controlled tap. "Open up!" A voice called, too calm, too confident. "We're just here to check on your safety." "Saw smoke from your chimney?" A lie. Daniel didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Another voice joined in, harsher, impatient. "Let's not drag this out. He has the dog." Shadow's growl deepened. The hunters had arrived, and they weren't leaving without a fight. The men outside exchanged murmured whispers, sharp, clipped phrases that Daniel recognized instantly. They weren't negotiating. They were coordinating, preparing to breach. Daniel's pulse quickened, not with fear but with the familiar clarity that came before a fight. He reached quietly for the emergency firearm. Hidden beneath the edge of a wooden floorboard, an old habit from years of never feeling safe enough to sleep without a plan, Shadow sensed the shift immediately. His ears twitched. His eyes snapped open wider, determination cutting through his exhaustion like a blade. He pushed his front paws forward, shaky but purposeful. "Hey," Daniel whispered urgently. "Stay down? You're hurt." But Shadow ignored him. With a trembling growl, he dragged himself forward inch by inch, positioning his weakened body between Daniel and the door. Even on the brink of collapse, Shadow's instincts screamed one thing: protect. Daniel's throat tightened. This dog had been beaten, betrayed, left for dead, yet he still stood, however unsteadily, to guard someone he barely knew. A metallic click echoed outside. Safety off, Daniel barely had time to react before the door crashed inward, wood splintering as two armed men stormed the cabin. Their movements were swift, trained, lethal. One raised his weapon, Shadow lunged at. It was not the powerful leap of a fully trained military dog, but a desperate, wounded surge of courage. His body slammed into the intruder's leg, sending the shot veering off course. The bullet tore through the cabin wall instead of Daniel's chest. "Shadow!" Daniel shouted as the dog hit the floor hard, a pained yelp bursting from his throat. The intruder stumbled backward, stunned that the dying dog had managed to move at all. The second man cursed and pivoted toward the animal, gun raised for a killing shot. Daniel didn't hesitate. He launched forward, tackling the man with full force, sending both crashing into the wooden table. The gun skittered across the floor. Shadow, panting, bleeding, forced himself toward the weapon, dragging his body inch by inch to block the intruder's reach. Even broken, even dying Shadow refused to let them win. Daniel hit the intruder with enough force to knock the air from both their lungs. They rolled across the wooden floor, fists slamming, boots scraping, the cramped cabin turning into a battlefield of crashing furniture and flying debris. The second man recovered quickly, swinging a brutal elbow toward Daniel's head, but Daniel ducked. Years of combat reflexes igniting like fire in his muscles, he drove his knee into the man's ribs once, twice, until the intruder groaned and loosened his grip. Daniel seized the moment, twisting the attacker's arm behind his back and slamming him face down onto the floorboards. A crack echoed. Maybe bone. Maybe wood? Daniel didn't stop to check. A gun cocked behind him. Daniel froze. The first intruder Shadow had knocked him down, but not out, was back on his feet, gun raised, eyes ice cold. "Move, Hayes," he hissed. "Step away from him." Daniel's mind raced. He could disarm a man, fight empty-handed, even take a bullet if he had to. But Shadow, bleeding, gasping, wouldn't survive another attack. The man's lip curled. "We only needed the dog." "But you had to interfere, didn't you?" Daniel glared back. "You tried to kill a soldier. That's not interference. That's justice." The intruder laughed darkly. "That mutt knew things he shouldn't, now you know them too." He steadied his gun. Shadow lifted his head, broken, weak, but still fighting, with every ounce of strength left in his body. The dog dragged himself forward and rammed his body into the attacker's leg. The gun fired wild, uncontrolled, shattering a lantern behind Daniel and sending shards of glass raining across the room. Daniel lunged. He caught the man's wrist, twisting hard, forcing the gun sideways. The intruder cried out, losing his grip as Daniel delivered a crushing blow to his throat. The man collapsed, struggling for air. Daniel didn't hesitate. He kicked the weapon across the room and turned just as the second intruder staggered to his feet. Daniel struck first one punch, then another, driving him backward until he crashed into the cabin wall and slid down. Unconscious. Silence fell. Heavy, breathless, covered in dust and blood. Daniel turned to Shadow. The dog lay trembling, sides rising unevenly. Yet his eyes still burned with loyalty and something else. Relief. Daniel knelt beside him, voice rough. "You saved my life again." Shadow's tail twitched once, a soldier's answer. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and splintered wood. The aftermath of a battle neither Daniel nor Shadow had asked for, but had survived together. Daniel secured the intruders with paracord, tying their wrists and ankles with practiced efficiency. He had no idea how many more were out there, but he knew time was running thin. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Shadow's gaze followed him, weary but alert. Daniel knelt beside the dog and placed a reassuring hand on his head. "Hang in there, soldier," he whispered. "We're almost there." He grabbed the collar again, turning it toward the lantern's remaining flicker of light. The encrypted sequence etched along the inner lining coordinates, mission data, and a final string of numbers Daniel hadn't decoded yet seemed heavier now. This wasn't just evidence. This was a message Shadow had carried through fire, betrayal, and a death sentence. Daniel opened his battered notebook and cross-referenced the numbers. Slowly, painfully, the truth unfolded. Shadow's last mission hadn't been about locating stolen weapons. It had been about uncovering a smuggling operation, one run by the very officers meant to stop it. Military-grade explosives, ammunition, classified components, all being sold to criminal groups overseas. Shadow had detected the contraband inside the compound long before the ambush. His warning bark, the one his handler ignored, hadn't been a mistake. It had been a threat, not to the enemy, but to the corrupt officers running the operation. Daniel clenched his jaw as the final realization sank in. The explosion wasn't an accident. It was orchestrated, a cover-up meant to kill the dog who knew too much and anyone who might talk. But Shadow had survived, barely, and the officer who tried to silence him realized the risk. So he dragged the dog deep into the mountains, hung him from a tree, and left him to die with a sign to discredit him. Too dangerous. Too unpredictable. A perfect excuse. Daniel shook his head slowly, sickened by the betrayal. "You weren't too dangerous," he whispered. "You were too loyal? Too smart?" Shadow's eyelids fluttered. As if answering, the truth was no longer just hidden secrets on a collar. It was evidence. Evidence that could take down an entire criminal network, and now Daniel knew exactly why men were willing to kill to get it back. Daniel didn't waste another second. With the intruders bound and Shadow fading fast, he grabbed his satellite phone from the emergency kit. His hands shook not from fear, but from fury. He'd seen corruption in war zones, but betrayal this deep, this personal, it made his blood boil. He dialed a direct line one only former military personnel with clearance still possessed. "Colonel Reeves," a hardened voice answered. "Sir, this is Sergeant Daniel Hayes," Daniel said, breath tight. "I have evidence of an internal smuggling operation and 2 operatives attempting to destroy it. I need immediate extraction." There was a long, stunned silence. Then the colonel's tone sharpened. "Send coordinates? We're mobilizing now." Daniel relayed the information, including the encrypted data from Shadow's collar. Reeves swore under his breath. "Hayes, if what you're saying is true, this is bigger than anything we've seen in years. Hold position." "Reinforcements inbound?" The call ended. Daniel exhaled slowly. Shadow whimpered weakly, shifting his head. Daniel knelt beside him, brushing a hand gently across the dog's fur. "Help is coming, buddy. Just stay with me." Minutes dragged like hours, every crack of a branch outside forcing Daniel to raise his weapon and check the perimeter. He didn't know if more men were coming. He didn't know if they had tracked the signal. All he knew was that he would die before he let anyone near. Shadow again? Then finally he heard it, helicopter blades thundering through the sky, powerful searchlights, swept across the treetops as tactical teams descended into the clearing, weapons drawn, movements sharp and controlled. Daniel stepped out of the cabin, hands raised, identifying himself. Within minutes, the intruders were hauled away, screaming threats that were drowned out by the roar of engines. Officers collected Shadow's collar, photographed the codes, and secured the evidence. Colonel Reeves himself approached Shadow, kneeling beside the wounded dog. "You brave boy," he said quietly. "You saved lives today." Shadow blinked, barely conscious, but for the first time since Daniel found him hanging from that tree, he wasn't in danger. He was being protected. Justice had finally begun. 2 days later, Daniel stood in the quiet hallway of the Military Veterinary Center, the sterile scent of antiseptic thick in the air. Behind the glass window, Shadow lay on a padded recovery bed. IV lines running from his paw, bandages wrapped around his neck and flank. Machines beeped steadily, each sound a reminder that the dog who had been left to die was still fighting, still choosing life. A doctor approached with a small smile. He's stable now. Lost a lot of blood, but he's responding better than expected. This dog, he has the will of a soldier. Daniel nodded slowly, emotion building in his chest. Yeah, he does. The doctor hesitated, then added, given the nature of the case and the fact that his unit has been disbanded due to the investigation, Shadow has no assigned handler anymore. He'll need long-term rehabilitation and someone he trusts. Daniel didn't need time to think. I'll take him, he said, voice steady. The doctor's smile widened. I had a feeling you'd say that. Hours later, as sunlight warmed the recovery room, Daniel stepped inside. Shadow's ears twitched. His eyes opened soft, tired, but recognizing the man immediately. He struggled to lift his head. Hey, easy, Daniel said, kneeling beside him. You don't have to get up, I'm right here. Shadow let his head fall gently against Daniel's hand, releasing a slow breath. It wasn't a growl or a whine, it was trust. Pure, unbroken trust. Something that had nearly been stolen from him. Daniel stroked the dog's fur. You were thrown away by the people who should have protected you, but that ends now, from today on. You're home. Shadow's tail thumped once against the blankets, weak but certain. Outside the window, dawn broke across the horizon, painting the sky in gentle gold. A new day. A new mission. 2 soldiers, 1 human, 1 canine, finally finding peace in each other. And from that moment on, Daniel Hayes and Shadow were no longer survivors of betrayal. They were family.